Washington, D.C., late 1980s, a city of monuments and shadows, where power and memory walk side by side. On a quiet Sunday morning in a modest row house neighborhood, a house tucked behind wrought iron gates and overgrown hydrangeas held its own secret rhythm. Maria Thompson, widow and lifelong resident of that street, sat by the window, nursing a cup of tea while light danced through the magnolia blossoms, when she saw him again. An elderly man in a weathered overcoat, hat brim pulled low, standing motionless at her garden gate. He had been there countless Sundays before, always the same posture, always the same stillness. He never rang the bell. He never knocked. He did not speak. For years, his presence fluttered at the periphery of her life, an unspoken question that threaded itself through her mornings. Maria had wondered whether he was a neighbor, or someone haunted by loss, or a visitor from another life altogether. Why come each Sunday to stand before her gate and do nothing more? The city was loud with voices, broadcast towers, newspaper headlines, public protests. Yet this man was quiet, almost invisible, and in that silence he became more potent than any shout. Then one Sunday afternoon, amidst chirping sparrows and a soft wind in the branches, her grandson David, 9 years old and full of restless curiosity, wandered into the backyard with a trowel and hands stained by earth. He unearthed something glinting underneath a tangle of roots and soil. It was a medal, tarnished but still proud, inscribed with a soaring eagle and the initials J.H. Beside it, half buried, lay an old iron box. Maria's heart twisted. She sensed that everything she thought she knew was being pulled into a new narrative. With trembling fingers, she helped him lift the box. The rusted lid creaked to reveal a folded, yellowed letter. She unfolded it, breath caught, and read the first words. "Dear Maria." The Sunday ritual of silence cracked wide open. The letter's first line carried a weight she never imagined. It was not just a memory unearthed, it was a reckoning. That moment shifted everything. The rigid Sundays, the quiet waiting, the questions that hovered unspoken, all had meaning now. A hidden story, buried beneath soil and silence, had begun to breathe. What he had never dared speak might now declare itself. If this story tugs at your heart, if you sense the weight that silence can carry, leave a like and subscribe. Let's give voice to stories that whisper in the cracks of memory and shadow. Brace yourself, because once silence is revealed, nothing remains the same. Maria Thompson's house sat in one of those quiet D.C. neighborhoods where history lingers not only in the architecture, but in the air, in the way old bricks absorb decades of footsteps, and gardens grow around stories untold. Her row house, with its ivy-covered fence and peeling shutters, stood as a silent observer of change. Children had grown and moved away, neighbors had come and gone, yet one presence had remained steady, as haunting and mysterious as time itself. Every Sunday morning for years she saw him, a tall, elderly man, always in the same coat, the same shoes, the same hat, pulled down just low enough to conceal his eyes. He stood at the gate, not in motion, not in a rush, as if time itself slowed down in his presence. He would stay there, silent and still, for about 10 minutes, never longer. Then he would walk away, down the street, hands in his pockets, leaving nothing behind but questions. At first, Maria thought it was coincidence. Perhaps he was visiting someone. Perhaps he was lost in habit, like so many who repeated small rituals to give shape to loneliness. But he never missed a Sunday. Through rain, snow, humid heat, he came, and every week Maria found herself drawn to the window, pretending to dust or adjust the curtain just to watch. He never looked up. He never knocked. She never opened the door. It became their unspoken agreement, one built not on conversation but on presence, a silent thread that connected them in a way neither dared to name. Maria didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived, but she knew the way he stood. She knew the shape of his shadow. She knew the exact moment when his footsteps would pause outside her home. Neighbors sometimes noticed. A few called him the gate ghost. Others whispered rumors. He was a widower, a veteran, someone displaced by the tides of gentrification or regret. No one seemed to know for certain. And in a city filled with people who make their lives out of certainties, facts, figures, power, this not knowing became its own kind of gravity. Maria had lost her husband years ago. Her father had served in World War II. Her own history was tied to men who came home quieter than they'd left. She had learned, painfully, that silence often spoke more than speeches. But this man's silence was different. It wasn't withdrawal. It was presence. It was commitment. It was watching without expecting. It was remembering without asking to be remembered. As time passed, Maria began to feel his absence during the weekdays, even though she didn't know his name. She noticed the way the garden gate creaked louder on days he didn't appear. She began planting more flowers along the edge where he always stood, as if grooming the space in honor of his stillness. There were times she thought of opening the door, of calling out, but something always stopped her, a strange blend of fear and respect. What if his silence wasn't waiting to be broken? What if it was sacred, held together by memory and pain? What if opening that door shattered not only his peace, but her own? So she waited, she wondered, and the silence returned, Sunday after Sunday. Only later, after the medal and the letter emerged from the soil, did she understand. This wasn't a random ritual. This was a man keeping a promise, to her, to a moment they had once shared, one that she had forgotten, but he never could. It happened on an ordinary spring afternoon, the kind where the air smells like lilacs and the wind carries a softness that makes you pause. Maria Thompson had opened the back door to let the breeze drift in while she folded laundry. In the backyard, her grandson David was digging in the corner near the old bird bath, a spot overgrown with weeds and half-forgotten stones. He was looking for buried treasure, as boys do when their imaginations run free and their hands crave dirt. He was just about to give up when the metal struck something hard. It wasn't rock. It made a dull, hollow sound. Curious, he dug deeper, brushing away layers of earth with his fingers. And then he saw it, a small object, circular and weathered, with the glint of something once polished. He called out, "Grandma, I found something!" Maria stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. David handed it to her, proud and wide-eyed. She turned it over in her palm. It was a military medal, old, slightly tarnished, but clearly stamped with an eagle and the letters J.H. on the back. Her fingers froze. Her breath caught. Those initials, that symbol. She looked toward the gate without meaning to, as if expecting him to be there. Of course, he wasn't, but something deep in her memories stirred. David kept digging, now more excited, and moments later he struck something else, a rusted iron box sealed tight with age. Together they knelt in the grass. The box was about the size of a paperback, dented in one corner but intact. With great care, Maria pried the lid open. Inside, a folded cloth and an envelope yellowed with time. On the envelope, for Maria. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. Her heart pounded as she pulled the letter out, unfolded it carefully, and read the name signed at the bottom, John Harlan. She sat back on her heels. John Harlan, the man from the gate, the man who never spoke, the man who had stood there every Sunday for years without a word. This was his voice, finally. She read the letter slowly, as if afraid the words might vanish if she rushed. He told her that he once lived in this house, many years ago, that during the war, when he was just a boy, he had hidden in the garden one night, lost, scared, unsure of who to trust, and that a young girl with a gentle face, had opened the gate for him when no one else would. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak. She simply let him through. That girl, he wrote, was her. Maria could barely remember, but something about the story, the garden, the fear, the face of a child, felt like a memory just beyond her reach. He described how, after the war, he returned to find the house changed, owned by another family. But when he saw her again, years later, grown but unmistakable, he recognized her instantly. And though he never approached her, he felt he owed her everything. He wrote of how he had visited every Sunday to be near the place that saved him, and the person who unknowingly shaped his entire life. He wrote, of a love that wasn't romantic, but sacred. A gratitude so deep he could never quite find the words to speak aloud. The medal, he explained, was awarded to him after his service in Korea. It was one of the only things he kept, a reminder of honor, of duty, and of the girl who showed him mercy before the world had a name for it. He had buried the box years ago, he said, knowing he would never find the courage to speak, but hoping, maybe one day, it would find her. As she read the last line, Maria felt the world shift. The man she'd feared, wondered about, quietly mourned. He had not been a stranger. He had been waiting for her all along. Maria read the letter again that night, sitting by the kitchen window with the box beside her as the streetlights cast soft halos through the lace curtains. Outside, the garden whispered in the breeze, and in the silence of the house, a silence that once belonged to Sundays, she heard the words as if they were being spoken aloud. I never had the courage to knock, but I stood there every Sunday to remind myself that the world once gave me a moment of mercy, that you did. John Harlan's words were not poetic, not polished, but they carried weight. A man who had survived war, who had grown old carrying a secret, now confessing in ink and trembling handwriting the quiet love he had held for a woman who never knew. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no declarations of passion, no longing for what could have been. Instead, it was reverent. John spoke of Maria the way one might speak of a cathedral or a battlefield, with awe and distance, and an understanding that some things are sacred precisely because they are never touched. He remembered her not as she was now, but as the girl in the doorway, the girl who opened the gate that night in 1944 when he was a boy on the run. He had escaped a group of soldiers after being separated from his family, and he had hidden in backyards and alleys for hours, maybe longer, until he found her fence. He remembered her face in the moonlight, the way she didn't hesitate. She hadn't spoken, but he always said the silence that night was the kindest sound he'd ever known. After the war, he rebuilt his life, joined the army, served in Korea, came back to D.C. quietly, without family, without noise. He bought books, walked the same streets, but when he found the house again, her house, something in him changed. He recognized the hydrangeas, the gate, and eventually her. He saw her through the window once, and again, until he found himself there every Sunday, not out of obsession, but ritual. You reminded me, he wrote, that goodness doesn't need witnesses, that courage can be quiet. He had stood outside her home for decades, watching, remembering, not asking for anything, not even acknowledgement. He had buried the box 10 years earlier as his legs weakened and his hands began to tremble too much to hold a pen. He couldn't risk losing the words before they reached her. Maria was overwhelmed, not with sorrow, but with something deeper, gratitude, humility, a strange, aching warmth. The idea that someone could carry a memory of her for so long, so silently, without ever expecting anything in return, shook her in a way no words ever had. Her mind reached back, trying to find the girl he described. She could vaguely recall the war years, the tension, the rules, the air raid drills, but the face of a lost boy, the act of opening a gate in the dark. It was only a blur, if anything, and yet she didn't doubt him, not for a second. This was real, and it had changed her life, even now, even this late. She thought of the years he had watched her prune her roses, sit with a book on the porch, wave to neighbors. All the while, he had stood just feet away, grateful to simply be close. He had given her space, time, reverence. He had loved her in the purest way someone can love, without ever needing to be loved back. For Maria, this wasn't regret. It wasn't a missed opportunity. It was a gift, a blessing disguised as a stranger. She folded the letter gently and placed it back in the box. Then with a small motion, she set the medal on top, the last piece of him she would ever hold. And in the quiet of her kitchen, under a soft lamp, and the sound of spring rain beginning to fall, Maria whispered aloud, "Thank you for remembering me." The next morning, the air outside was still. The kind of stillness that makes you pause before opening the door, as if the world itself is waiting. Maria stepped onto her porch, holding the iron box, the letter folded carefully inside, the medal placed on top like a seal. She looked out at the garden, at the spot near the old bird bath where it had all been found. And then, slowly, she turned her gaze toward the gate, that gate where he had stood year after year and never come inside. She would never get to thank him in person. John Harlan had passed away just months earlier. A quiet death in a quiet apartment 2 blocks away. The obituary was brief. No listed relatives, no military honors, no mention of his years of Sunday visits. Only a neighbor remembered him. A nice man, kept to himself, read a lot. The building manager said they found few personal items in his unit, just some clothes, a few old photos, and one small frame on the nightstand. The photo was black and white. A young girl standing at a garden gate, her hands folded in front of her. The image was slightly blurred, but her face was unmistakable. It was Maria. He had kept her with him all that time. Maria felt no bitterness in that realization, no sadness even, only reverence. The meeting they never had, the conversation they never shared, had become something else entirely. Their story had been lived not in words, but in gestures, in memory, in faithful presence. Later that day, Maria returned to the garden with David. She handed him a trowel and, kneeling beside him, dug a small hole near the base of the hydrangeas. There, she placed the iron box back into the soil, not as a burial, but as a kind of return, a quiet honoring of what had remained quiet for so long. Above the spot, she planted a new rose bush, red, full, elegant, a rose meant to last. A rose that would bloom each spring, without needing to be spoken to. Next to it, David placed a small wooden plaque they'd carved together. The inscription was simple, burned carefully into the grain. For the man who never knocked, but never left. That night, Maria sat by the window again. The garden looked the same, yet not. The gate stood quiet, the wind brushing softly against it. She could almost see him there, not in body, but in memory. In the rustle of leaves, the bend of the branch, the silence between sounds. In that moment, she realized, some meetings don't happen when we expect them to. They happen in gardens, in letters, in gestures that outlive the people who make them. Maria hadn't lost anything. She had gained a truth most people never receive. That she had once been someone's moment of mercy, and that for decades, that small act had kept someone alive, even if silently. The seasons changed, but the rose never failed to bloom. Every spring, as the sun returned and the air grew warm, Maria would find herself drawn to the place beneath the hydrangeas, where roots now curled gently around the box that held a letter, a medal, and a memory too large to name. The rose blossomed quietly, deeply, crimson against the green, as if it knew what it stood for. Maria tended it without ceremony. No speeches, no heavy thoughts, just care, just presence. And sometimes, when the morning light slanted just right, she would glance at the gate and imagine him there, not as a ghost, not as a man she never really met, but as someone who had always been part of her story, quietly, faithfully, without needing to be seen. David grew older, but he never forgot. The story became part of his own legacy. He told it at school once, in a classroom full of kids who had never heard of the Korean War, who thought silence was just something awkward. But when he finished reading his essay, no one laughed. One girl even wiped her eyes, because something in the truth had reached them, that even the quietest love, even the smallest act of kindness, can echo through decades. The plaque remained. Visitors sometimes stopped and read it, not knowing the full story, only sensing that it meant something. A few left flowers. One person left a folded American flag. Maria never questioned the gifts. The garden had become more than hers. It had become memory, rooted in soil. Sometimes, Maria would sit with her tea and think about all the years she'd spent wondering who the man at the gate was. All the Sundays filled with silence. And now, how every piece fit into place, not with dramatic confrontation, not with declarations, but with a letter in a box, a name signed in trembling ink, and a rose that kept blooming. She didn't mourn what could have been. She honored what was, because in a world so full of noise, someone had chosen silence, and in that silence, he had chosen her. We share new stories every day, real stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who understands the weight of silence. Tag someone who carries a memory, a gesture, a letter never read. Because sometimes the quietest voices are the ones we need to hear the most.